On the night of April 5, 1862, 40,000 Confederate soldiers lay in the wet Tennessee woods less than 2 miles from a Union army that had no idea they were there. They had marched out of Corinth, Mississippi 2 days earlier, struggling through mud and rain, their supply wagons bogging down on roads that barely deserved the name. Inexperienced boys had fired their rifles into the dark out of nerves, and animals had brayed so loudly that General P.G.T. Beauregard, second in command of the Confederate force, was convinced the element of surprise was already dead. He told General Albert Sidney Johnston that the attack should be called off, that the Federal troops across the field had surely heard them coming and would be waiting behind fortifications. Johnston had assembled roughly 44,000 men for this operation, the largest Confederate force yet fielded in the Western theater. Veterans of Shiloh's Prelude, conscripts barely finished with their drilling, boys from Mississippi and Tennessee and Louisiana and Kentucky who had never heard a musket fired in anger and who spent that sodden night in the woods eating cold rations and listening to the artillery rumble of what they could not know was their own army's carelessness. The Army had 4 corps: Bragg, Hardee, Polk, and Breckinridge. It had marched in a sequence designed to keep separate units from entangling each other on narrow roads, but the roads had refused to cooperate, and by the time the lead elements reached their assault positions, the whole plan was hours behind schedule. Beauregard had every rational reason to call it off. Johnston listened. Then he said something that, by the following afternoon, would take on the weight of prophecy. He said they would water their horses in the Tennessee River, or they would leave most of their army there, trying. The Confederate army did not turn back. On the other side of those woods, at a cluster of log cabins and canvas tents along the western bank of the Tennessee River called Pittsburg Landing, roughly 45,000 Union soldiers were doing what soldiers do when they believe they are safe. They were eating. They were writing letters home. They were drilling in the fields and complaining about the mud, the food, the officers, and the particular misery of an early spring in western Tennessee. The Army was under the command of Major General Ulysses S. Grant, and it had gathered at Pittsburg Landing for a purpose that was, at that moment, purely offensive. Grant was not expecting a fight here. He was waiting for reinforcements, specifically the Army of the Ohio under Don Carlos Buell, and once those forces arrived, the combined Federal host would march south and destroy the Confederate rail junction at Corinth, which would effectively sever the entire Mid-South from the rest of the Confederacy. Nobody had told Grant that the Confederacy had decided not to wait for him. The intelligence failures in the days leading up to April 6th were not subtle. They were the kind that, looked at afterward, make you wonder what it takes for a commander to take a threat seriously. Union cavalry had skirmished with Confederate patrols on April 4th, and again on April 5th. A private in the 25th Missouri Infantry named John Cockrell later recalled that on the night before the battle, he could hear what sounded like a large force moving somewhere out in the dark. Not close, but not nothing either. At least 2 brigade commanders sent reports up the chain of command warning that something was massing to the south. One of those reports reached General William Tecumseh Sherman, who was commanding the division camped farthest south at a place called Shiloh Church, directly in the path of what was coming. Sherman, who would later become one of the most strategically perceptive commanders of the entire war, dismissed the reports. He sent a message to Grant saying he had no doubt the enemy was saucy and had artillery, but that he did not anticipate anything beyond a skirmish. Grant, still recovering from a badly sprained ankle suffered when his horse slipped in the mud several days earlier, was at his headquarters at the Cherry Mansion in Savannah, Tennessee, 9 miles downriver from the landing, when the attack began. He heard the guns before he had finished breakfast. What broke open on the morning of April 6, 1862, was not a battle so much as a catastrophe that had to be converted into a battle in real time. The Confederate assault began just after dawn, and within the first hour it had shattered 2 Union brigades and driven them off the field entirely. Men who had been sleeping in their tents were suddenly running through the trees with no idea which direction led to safety and which direction led into the Confederate advance. The noise alone, the combined roar of thousands of muskets, the crack and boom of artillery, the screaming, was enough to convince many soldiers who had never seen combat before that the only rational response was to get as far away from the sound as possible, as fast as their legs would carry them. The first Confederate wave, under General Hardee, struck the divisions of Prentiss and Sherman almost simultaneously. Hardee's corps had been designated the vanguard specifically because it contained the Army's most experienced soldiers, and it hit the Union front with the kind of momentum that comes when a large force has been waiting all night to move and suddenly gets permission. The Federal pickets, those few men posted on the outer edges of the camp, opened fire and were overrun. Some managed to fall back and spread the alarm. Others were simply absorbed into the chaos. Within 30 minutes of the first shots, the Confederate advance had covered the ground between the tree line and the Union camps, with men who were screaming the rebel yell, a sound that veterans on both sides described not as a cheer, but something more animal, high and sustained, designed to unnerve rather than inspire. General Sherman was almost killed in the first hour. A Confederate ball passed through his hand. His orderly, riding beside him, was shot dead off his horse. At one point, Sherman found himself looking directly at a line of Confederate infantry at close range, and later said that the moment he saw their faces, he understood that everything he had told Grant the night before was wrong. He performed, by most accounts, remarkably well for the rest of the day, rallying fragments of broken units, repositioning artillery, getting knocked off his horse twice more. But the simple fact is that the attack he had refused to believe was possible was now happening, and the entire Union Army was scrambling to survive it. Grant arrived at Pittsburg Landing around 8 in the morning, pulling himself onto his horse with the help of the boat's railing, his swollen ankle barely able to bear the weight of a stirrup. What he found was not a battle in progress, it was a system in the process of collapsing. Thousands of men had already broken from their units and made their way to the river bluff below the landing, where they pressed themselves against the clay bank and refused to move. Estimates of the numbers who had fled there by midday range from 5,000 to 15,000 men. Some were wounded, many were not. Officers rode among them, pleading, threatening, drawing pistols. Almost nobody moved. The bluff had become, in the span of a few hours, the largest concentration of cowardice and terror that the Western theater of the Civil War would ever produce in a single location. And it is worth noting that before the day was over, the men who stayed and fought would have every reason in the world to envy them. Grant rode the length of the field, doing what corps commanders were supposed to do in those days, showing himself to the men, sending orders, trying to keep fractured brigades from dissolving entirely. He was in pain from his ankle, and he was fully aware that his army was being pushed toward the river. He was also aware that if it reached the river, it would have nowhere left to go. The Confederate plan on April 6th was designed by General Braxton Bragg, later to become one of the most reviled commanders in Confederate history, and it called for 3 corps to advance in parallel waves across the entire width of the Union line. The logic was sound. Hit the whole line at once, find the weaknesses, pour through them, push the Yankees into the river before Buell could arrive. Johnston, commanding the full army, rode forward to lead personally, something that corps commanders in 1862 still did as a matter of course, and that division and brigade commanders did constantly. This made them effective. It also made them exposed. What the Confederate attack ran into in the middle of the Union line was a place it did not expect. The area the soldiers would come to call the Hornet's Nest was not a prepared defensive position. It was a sunken farm road flanked by a patch of woods and an open field. And the Union forces that ended up there, parts of Benjamin Prentiss's division and what remained of W.H.L. Wallace's, did not choose it so much as find themselves there after the rest of the line had broken around them. But the combination of the sunken road, the natural cover along its edges, and the stubborn refusal of Prentiss to give ground turned that stretch of field into the most costly patch of real estate in the entire battle. The Confederate attacks on the Hornet's Nest went on for most of the afternoon. Historians have argued about the exact number of assaults, but 12 separate charges is a figure that appears consistently across the accounts of both Union and Confederate survivors. 12 times, Confederate infantry formed up, stepped into the open field, and came forward under fire. 12 times they were stopped. The dead piled in the grass. The Confederates brought up 62 artillery pieces, the largest massed battery assembled in the Western Hemisphere up to that point, and opened a sustained bombardment that by every account was deafening beyond comprehension. Trees were cut in half, the ground was shredded. Men who survived the Hornet's Nest rarely talked about anything else for the rest of their lives. But the Hornet's Nest was buying time. Every hour Prentiss held on was an hour Buell was not yet at the river. An hour the gunboats USS Tyler and USS Lexington were still in position to sweep the Confederate flanks. An hour that the handful of artillery officers who had managed to collect the Army's remaining guns into a final defensive line near the landing were still loading and loading and loading. There was another reason the Confederate assault lost momentum that afternoon. One that had nothing to do with Federal stubbornness. Albert Sidney Johnston, the man who had told Beauregard they would water their horses in the Tennessee River, was struck by a bullet sometime around 2:30 in the afternoon while leading his forces in the attack near the Confederate right. The ball passed through the back of his right knee, severing an artery. Johnston's boot began to fill with blood. He had recently sent his personal surgeon to tend to some Union wounded, and so there was nobody nearby who recognized the wound for what it was. Johnston swayed in the saddle. His aides thought he was dizzy from the noise and the exertion. He slid off his horse and died within minutes, bled out in a hollow in the Tennessee woods, his boot still full of blood. A tourniquet applied at almost any point in those minutes could have saved him. The death of Johnston is one of the most argued over moments in Civil War historiography. Jefferson Davis considered him the finest soldier in the Confederacy, perhaps in the entire country. His partisans have argued for 160 years that his death at Shiloh robbed the Confederacy of the one man who might have finished what was started that morning. His critics point to the disorganization that had already set in across the Confederate front by the time he died, and suggest that the outcome of April 6th had already been decided by the terrain and the tenacity of the Hornet's Nest. What is not arguable is that when Beauregard took command, the Confederate advance never again had the same pressure behind it that it had in the morning, and by evening, with the sun going down and the massed Union artillery near the landing still untaken, Beauregard stopped the assault and ordered his forces to hold what they had. He sent a telegram to Richmond announcing a complete victory. The Hornet's Nest finally fell around 5:30 in the evening, when the Confederate encirclement was complete, and Prentiss, his ammunition gone and his men having held for the better part of 6 hours, surrendered what was left of his command, roughly 2,000 men. W.H.L. Wallace had been shot through the head while trying to break out and was left for dead on the field. Remarkably, his wife, Anne, who had come to the landing to visit him just before the battle, would sit with him for days after, and Wallace would live for 3 more days before dying of his wound, long enough to know she was there. By nightfall on April 6th, the Union Army had been driven back almost to the river. The line Grant had scraped together near the landing held, barely, anchored by 50-odd artillery pieces under the general supervision of Colonel Joseph Webster. The gunboats lobbed shells into the Confederate positions throughout the night, each 8 to 10 minutes, each shell arcing through the darkness and bursting somewhere in the soggy Tennessee woods. Survivors on both sides remembered the sound of those explosions as something close to torture. The slow, irregular rhythm of them, the impossibility of sleeping, the certainty that the next one might land on you specifically. Confederate soldiers who had been advancing and fighting for 14 hours straight now lay in the mud they had captured and tried to rest in the intervals between the blasts. It rained that night. Of course it rained. Grant did not sleep. He spent part of the night under a tree near the landing, and at some point, General William Bull Nelson, one of Buell's officers, whose troops had begun arriving by ferry across the river at dusk, came to him and found him standing there in the rain with his hat pulled low and a cigar clamped in his teeth, staring at nothing in particular. Nelson later said he asked Grant how things stood. Grant said nothing useful. Somewhere in the darkness, General Sherman found him in roughly the same spot. Sherman, who had been shot in the hand and knocked off horses and watched men die around him all day, and probably had the worst day of his professional life up to that point, looked at Grant for a moment and then said something to the effect that they had had the devil's own day of it. Grant smoked. Then he said, "Yes. Lick 'em tomorrow, though." That exchange, brief, unadorned, the whole of Grant's philosophy in 4 words, has been quoted so many times that it risks losing the weight it must have carried in that moment. Sherman had not come to that tree to strategize. He had come, at some level, to find out if Grant was going to retreat, because retreating was the rational response to what had just happened. The army had been surprised, mauled, and pushed to the edge of the water. Its left flank had been effectively destroyed. Thousands of its men were crouching under the river bluff, refusing to fight. Its commanding general had a broken ankle and had spent the entire day riding through chaos with no fixed headquarters and no reliable communications with half his corps. Every textbook of the era said you retreated. Grant did not own a copy of that textbook, or if he did, he had not read it carefully. The reinforcements that arrived overnight changed the arithmetic of the following morning in ways that Beauregard had not prepared for. Lew Wallace's division, which had taken a wrong road during the first day and arrived too late to fight on April 6th, a fact that would shadow Wallace's reputation for the rest of his long life, long enough for him to still be defending himself when he wrote Ben-Hur, was now in position on the Union right. Buell's Army of the Ohio had ferried across the Tennessee through the night and formed up on the Union left. Grant's battered command held the center. When daylight came on April 7th, it was the Confederates who were surprised. Beauregard's army had gone to sleep in the positions it had taken the previous day with a reasonable expectation that the morning would bring a continued Union retreat, or at worst a defensive fight that his exhausted and depleted force could manage. What it got instead was an assault by a Union force that was substantially larger than it had been the night before, against men who had been fighting hard since the previous dawn, who had expended enormous amounts of ammunition, whose supplies were not keeping up with the advance, and who were now spread across 2 miles of captured ground that was difficult to reinforce and impossible to maintain. The fighting on April 7th was brutal and grinding in a way that the first day had not been, not chaotic, but hard. The kind of combat where the momentum shifts back and forth across the same ground and the same trees get shot through by both sides over the course of several hours. The Confederates gave ground slowly, then less slowly. The Union artillery, which had been so critical the night before, now moved forward and did the same work it had done from a fixed position, now rolling ahead through the captured ground. By early afternoon, Beauregard had reached the conclusion that his army was not going to hold, and rather than lose it entirely, he began a fighting withdrawal back toward Corinth. By nightfall on April 7th, the Army of the Tennessee was back where it started, give or take a few hundred yards of Tennessee mud. Grant had survived, the army had survived, and the cost of those 2 days, the cost of what surviving at Shiloh required, was a number that neither side had prepared itself to understand. The total casualties at Shiloh were roughly 23,000 men killed, wounded, or missing across both armies. In a single engagement that lasted parts of 2 days, more Americans were killed and wounded than in the entire Revolutionary War. More men fell at Shiloh than in all of America's previous wars combined. There were bodies lying in the fields and woods and in the water at the creek called Bloody Pond, where wounded men from both sides had dragged themselves to drink and had died there, coloring the water. There were so many dead horses that the odor, in the days that followed, was reported to be detectable miles away. There were wounded men who lay undiscovered in the underbrush for days because the army did not have enough ambulances or stretcher bearers or surgeons to reach all of them, and some of those men died of exposure and thirst within earshot of their own camp. The surgeons who did reach the wounded worked in conditions that would be familiar to anyone who has read the medical accounts of any Civil War battle, and utterly incomprehensible to anyone who is not. Field hospitals were set up in tents, and in the handful of structures still standing near the landing, the log churches, the farmhouses, the sheds. Limbs were removed on improvised tables outside because there was no room indoors, and the piles of amputated arms and legs that accumulated beside those tables became, in the post-war accounts of nurses and soldiers alike, the single most consistent detail recalled about what the aftermath looked like. Not the bodies in the field, not the wreckage of the camps, the piles of limbs. Men who had gone to Shiloh as volunteers, as patriots, as adventurers seeking one clean engagement before the war ended and they went home, lay in the grass outside those hospitals and waited to find out which version of themselves would survive the next few hours. The battlefield at Shiloh was something that no amount of newspaper reporting could fully prepare the Northern public, because the American newspaper reading public in April of 1962 had not yet developed a vocabulary for industrialized slaughter. Bull Run, the previous summer, had produced about 5,000 casualties combined. Shiloh produced nearly 5 times that. For a few weeks after the battle, a serious and sustained effort was made in Northern newspapers to argue that Grant had been surprised due to negligence, that he had been drinking before the battle, and the Union Army's near destruction on April 6th was the direct result of his incompetence. Henry Halleck, Grant's superior in the Department of the Missouri, arrived at Pittsburg Landing and essentially relieved Grant of effective command by appointing himself field commander of the combined armies. Grant was given the title of second in command, which meant he had no troops, no real function, and nothing to do but follow Halleck's methodical, slow, interminable advance on Corinth and think about resigning. He thought about it seriously. Sherman talked him out of it. What the critics never fully addressed, and what history would bear out over the following 3 years, was that the question of what happened on April 6th had a second half that was not being asked. Yes, Grant had been surprised. Yes, the army had been pushed to the water's edge. But Grant had not broken. He had not retreated. He had held through a night that would have convinced most commanders that the fight was over, and he had gone forward the next morning with more force than he had the day before, and he had driven Beauregard off the field. The surprise of April 6th was real. The response to it was also real. Shiloh did something to Grant that is difficult to measure, but impossible to ignore when you trace his career forward from that morning. Before Shiloh, Grant was a competent general who had taken Forts Henry and Donelson and demonstrated a willingness to move aggressively. After Shiloh, he was something else, or rather, he became more fully whatever he had always been. He told a journalist later that after Shiloh, he gave up any idea that the war was going to end quickly, that the South could be talked back into the Union, that a few impressive victories would cause the Confederacy to give up and come home. He said he understood at Shiloh that the war had to be prosecuted until the South's ability and will to fight were both destroyed, that half measures would only prolong the killing. That conclusion, hard, clear-eyed, stripped of the sentiment that still infected much of Northern thinking about the war, is the conclusion that eventually produced Vicksburg and the Overland Campaign and Appomattox. What happened at Shiloh also ended Albert Sidney Johnston, and with him ended a version of Confederate Western strategy that had a real chance of working. Johnston's original concept, holding the vast arc of Confederate territory in the West with mobile defense, counterattacking Federal advances before they could consolidate, had already been compromised by the loss of the forts and the fall of Nashville. But Johnston, alive and commanding at Corinth, had the capacity and the aggression to mount a genuine challenge to Federal control of the Tennessee River Valley. Johnston, dead in a hollow near the Peach Orchard, left that challenge to Beauregard, and then to Bragg, and the Western Confederacy never quite found its footing again. Prentiss, whose decision to hold the Hornet's Nest cost him 2,000 men and his freedom for the next several months as a prisoner of war, was eventually exchanged and returned to service. He resigned his commission in 1863. For the rest of his life, he lived until 1901, he lectured and wrote about the battle, and his central argument was always the same, that the Hornet's Nest bought enough time for Grant to form the final defensive line near the landing, that without those 6 hours, the Confederate assault would have reached the river before the gunboats and the artillery could stop it, and that every Union soldier who crossed into Confederate territory after April 7, 1862, owed something to the men who loaded and fired and did not move in that sunken road. It is an argument that most historians, on reflection, have concluded is probably correct. Lew Wallace spent roughly the next 40 years trying to explain why his division took the wrong road on April 6th. The arguments he made were detailed, the documentation he compiled was substantial, and the bitterness he carried about Grant's post-war account of Shiloh in the personal memoirs was deep and public. Grant's memoirs, written while Grant was dying of throat cancer and driven partly by the need to leave his family financially secure, described Wallace's late arrival in terms that could not be read as anything other than criticism. Wallace responded with his own memoir. The two men never fully reconciled. Their argument about a single wrong road on a single afternoon in 1862 outlasted both of them. W.H.L. Wallace's wife, Anne, stayed at the landing after the battle and nursed her husband through the 3 days he survived. She was with him when he died. She took his body back to Ottawa, Illinois, where they had lived before the war. She never remarried. She kept his letters and his watch and his commission, and she lived to see the veterans of both armies come together at reunions, and she lived long enough for the country to put monuments over the graves at Shiloh. She died in 1917, 55 years after the peach orchard. The peach trees at Shiloh were in bloom on April 6, 1862. The petals fell through the day of the fighting, drifting down on the dead and the wounded in the grass below. Multiple soldiers mentioned it in their letters and diaries afterward, the strange incongruity of it. The trees doing what they did every April, indifferent to the fact that the ground beneath them was being soaked with blood. Spring coming on regardless. By the time the veterans began to return to Shiloh in the decades after the war, and they returned often in large organized groups, the blue and the gray walking the same ground together, the peach orchard had been replanted. The trees grew back. Every April they bloomed. The men who stood under them and looked out over the field where they had been young and terrified and often genuinely brave said nearly unanimously that the ground looked nothing like they remembered it, and also that it looked exactly the same. That is the nature of these places. The land holds something that the maps do not show, the particular stillness of a field where something enormous happened, the way the light falls through the trees in a way that makes it easy to imagine things that should be impossible to imagine. Shiloh National Military Park covers about 4,000 acres today, and on a weekday in the off-season, you can walk parts of the battle line in something close to silence, passing the monuments that mark each regiment stood, each battery fired, each general fell. The iron tablets are rusting in a way that looks permanent and appropriate. The unsunken road is still there. The Tennessee River is still at the bottom of the bluffs. The men who came back to these grounds in the decades after the war, and they came back often, old now, walking slowly, pointing at tree lines that had been replanted 2 or 3 times since they last saw them on fire, rarely agreed on details. They disagreed about times, about positions, about who had given which order and when. Memory does that. But they agreed on the feeling of April 6th, the sense of the ground opening beneath everything they had assumed was solid, the sense that the world they had ridden into that morning was not the world that existed by afternoon. Shiloh did that to a man. Once it had done it to him, nothing quite put the world back the way it had been before. 40,000 Confederate soldiers lay in those woods on the night of April 5, 1862, and the Union Army on the other side of the field did not know they were there. By the afternoon of April 7th, Beauregard was retreating toward Corinth, and Grant was alive and in command of a shattered, victorious army. And the war that both sides had imagined would be quick and clean and decided by one or two significant engagements was already, irreversibly, becoming something else entirely. Something longer. Something that would ask more of the country than the country had been willing to admit it had. Shiloh was where that admission happened. It was where the war stopped being a campaign and became a war. Nobody who was there ever fully came back from it.